Coming up on River City Presents, we're going to be discussing Machiavelli and his masterpiece, The Prince, with Professor of Political Science from Murray State University, Dr. Kevin Elliott. Welcome to River City Presents. I'm Daniel Hurt. When one thinks of Machiavelli, you cannot help but think of political statecraft, and when you think of that and political opportunism, one thinks of his seminal work, The Prince. Joining me on the program to talk about this is Murray State University Professor of Political Science, Dr. Kevin Elliott. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we had talked about doing this one as well, talking about Machiavelli, and I would say that what most people know of Machiavelli is he's this Italian guy who served in political office in Florentine, Italy, who got kicked out of power by the Medicis and who wrote this book maybe to get back in the good graces, and it's about how to take power and how to keep it. You think that's a fair assessment of where he's?
It is. If most people know that much about Machiavelli, they'd be very impressed.
Well, maybe me then.
Fantastic. Yes, no, that's
I took your class.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Anyone who takes my class, if they could come out with that, I'm very happy.
But that's a good way of putting it. So set the stage. Who is this man, and how does he get to the moment of the prince?
So understanding his time is quite important. So he is definitely right at the tail end of the Italian Renaissance. So we're talking about around 1500, right? He's born in 1469. He'll die in the first years of about 1520 or so, and. During this period of time, we know almost nothing about his childhood. The first, we hear of him is when he's appointed to be one of the top officials in the Florentine Republic. So the city of Florence, Italy, is at this time a city-state.
Italy's not united at all.
Right, that's right. So Italy again. Italy in this period is a geographic designator rather than a political one. There is no such thing as a state of Italy. There's no king of Italy, nothing like that. It is an assortment of city-states and kingdoms. Now, unlike Germany to the north, which doesn't really have that many large players and is mostly dominated by a single political entity, the Holy Roman Empire. Italy is a very different story. So Italy in Machiavelli's day, it's sort of in the what we would think of as the middle of Italy, or sort of the north, whatever, is composed of a bunch of little states. So you've got Venice, and you've got Milan, and you've got like Padua, and you have Florence, and then you also have in the middle of Italy the Papal States, which are directly ruled by the Pope. As a kind of kingdom. But then in the south of Italy, you have the Kingdom of Naples, sometimes called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Different periods of time, it has different names. And this, at various times, will be attached to the Spanish throne. It'll be a part of the Holy Roman Empire at some periods of time. It's a very complicated time. It's a very complicated place. And very importantly, you also have the Kingdom of France, right? Who is a northwestern neighbor, and the French are routinely intervening militarily in Italian politics. And you have the Holy Roman Emperor, who is the northeastern neighbor in Austria and the sort of states that today we'll think about them as other states, but many of them will be clients of like Hungary will be states that help compose the Holy Roman Empire. So likewise, the Holy Roman Emperor is at various times trying to extend his influence in northern Italy. So it's a mess.
Shifting alliances too, right?
Shifting alliances, exactly. You'll have city-states will attempt to achieve some form of independence, or you'll have elites within the Italian city-states will reach out to the French king or the Holy Roman Emperor to say, hey, help us, kick out the current government and put us in charge, and we will rule and we'll have a foreign policy that'll be friendly to you. So you'll have this very complicated factional politics, basically within every Italian city-state, having to do with foreign powers, having to do with local great families like the Medicis. So the Medicis are the ones who rule Florence. There's a revolution which gets rid of them. It's not really a democracy, but it's a much more popular government than the Medici, certainly, government. And that is the government that Machiavelli is a part of at the highest levels. In fact, at one point he serves as the ambassador to the French court, for instance, which is very important.
Seems as if it's like the perfect situation for a guy to write a book like this too, right? I mean, he's going to be exposed to all kinds of different ideas.
He's in the right place at the right time, and his position is uniquely good, because
that will come into some terms that we'll know maybe down the road. But so talk about in Florence at the time of his service. What is that government like? It's a republic, right? In a traditional sense, or
it's a republic in the sense. So all a republic means is a country that isn't a kingdom. That is to say, right? So a kingdom. In a kingdom, the kingdom belongs to the king, belongs to the prince. Think of it like, here's my cup, here's my car, here's my kingdom, right? It's like I own it the way that I would own any other piece of private property. A republic belongs to the people. That's why it's the term. Res publica the res is Latin for the thing. Public is the public thing. It's the public's thing. It's the thing that belongs to everybody. It belongs to the public. A republic, a republic could have any kind of government. You could have a king over a republic, as long as the king doesn't own the kingdom. So
like Britain.
Yeah. No. Technically,
sure.
But it's not a republic actually. But for instance, France. So in the 19th century, under the old regime, you had the king of France who owns it, right? But after, by various turns of revolution, eventually you'll get a period of time where you have a king of the French. The king of the French is made king by the Constitution, which is created by the people.
See, I was thinking constitutional monarchy with Britain, because it's the people's law, but the king sort of serves as...
And there you're just putting the shoe on the other foot.
Right.
So you can have a constitutional monarchy where it is technically still an absolute monarchy, and that is the case in Britain, technically, right? If the king ever tried to exercise real power, he'd be out.
Yeah.
Well, arguably. But it's the opposite case in many of in other constitutional monarchies, where the king, at least in the 19th century, where you'd have kings who would be empowered through some kind of constitutional system. In the case of Florence, you don't have a king. You have this kind of popular government. You had this very sort of complicated structure to it, and these things change. But the point is that it wasn't a principality. You did not have a single ruler. You had a kind of popular government, a kind of election, but it was dominated by people who are sort of a very common form of republic would be one that would be a government dominated by merchants, for instance, right? Merchants would be very important because they are wealthy, and so they control a lot of resources in the city, and so they would be, and the prosperity of the city would be linked to trade, and that's why merchants, as the people who are doing trade, who are overseeing trade, that's why they would be very prominent, because the well-being of everybody, right?
They're influencers, so to speak.
Yeah, well, yes. They are, and if you are someone working on the docks, trade is good for you. If you're someone who owns a tavern, trade is good for you. People coming in the town, right? So everybody in the town is benefited by trade in this way, and when that's the most important thing that the rulers care about, then that can be the source of guidance of policy, right? Whereas if you have a prince, right, and they're interested in conquest, for instance, maybe trade. If you're trading with the enemy, maybe don't want trade. Does that lead to a depression in the city? I don't really care, as long as I can still have my army and go out and fight. Now, Anyway, so
what is his? So how does he get to be in the position that he's in? What do they know?
we don't know a huge amount
so
about
he
this,
just
right? His early life.
his way in.
We don't know. Yeah, we don't know a huge amount about his early life, and so yeah, some of the stuff is just we're not really sure. We know that he acquires an enormous amount of experience in statecraft. We know that when the Medicis come back, that he is exiled from the city. But ironically, right, he's exiled from the city, but he can actually see the city from where from his country house, which today is just on the outskirts of the city of Florence. I've seen a picture from his front door, and you can clearly see Duomo, the cathedral, and he's very close, tantalizingly close to the city in his exile, and he is very much interested in trying to come back. The one other thing we know, somewhat interestingly, is that the Medicis, because he is one of the top officials in this previous government, he's imprisoned by the Medicis and is tortured by them at one point. But he will nonetheless write the prince in order to, as you said, get in the good graces of the Medicis to try and get himself a place back in government.
And before we get to that, what is life like when the Medicis take it back? How does that change life in Florence?
It might not change it that much if you're not in the government, right? So insofar as these Renaissance states don't really regulate life as thoroughly as we might think of today. So the policy of a Republican government is not going to be all that different from the from the policy of a Medici government with respect to like how much it affects your daily life. The economy of the city is going to be more or less the same. The day-to-day life of Florentines is going to be more or less the same.
And as long as the trains run on time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So he's
now where the trains go might be different, right? Right. So if you're a Florentine soldier, you might be going to fight over the city of Pisa under the Republican government, whereas you're going to go up and try and help, whatever the Medicis conquer, Venice or something different.
Almost sounds mercenarian. But
what's going to matter a lot is the foreign policy, and I mean, and it does have effects in terms of like taxes, like where does the tax money go? Who are you allowed to trade with, and on what terms? Those are the types of policies that will change, and those will affect individuals in the city, but rather indirectly, and it might not be as apparent.
So Machiavelli, when he's writing The Prince, he writes a letter to like his friend, sort of outlining an interesting. I think the letter's interesting because it sort of alludes to what his agenda might be with it. So can you tell us a little bit about the letter and maybe why he writes it?
Yeah, well, so I mean, he's in exile, right? So he's a man of letters. So he's keeping up his friendship, which is also somewhat of a, I don't want to say it's professional, but it is one of these friendships. This is somebody who's in a position to help him, sure, but the key thing is that he's keeping up a personal relationship and keeping up a professional relationship.
He's a politician at heart. So.
Exactly. And so, it has the kind of, much of it is about, he's working on this land and he's clearing this thing and he has these workers and he has to pay them some out, whatever. It's got a lot of just like quotidian kind of, day-to-day stuff. But it does also provide us a picture of what his life in exile is like. So he is doing these kind of everyday things as a sort of manager, but he is also engaging in reflection. So he says, I come home from doing all this daily work, I take off my filthy clothes, I put on my statesman's outfit, right? His clothes from his time as a counselor of state.
He's like getting into character.
Yeah, some people said he puts on his toga, right? And he goes into his study, and he'll spend hours reading the classics, so reading Plutarch and reading these sort of Greek and Roman thinkers, Cicero, and he will find him, and he explains that his what he's doing is that he's asking questions of these ancient thinkers. He imagines himself in dialogue with them, and he is getting answers to his questions from them. He's asking and they are answering. And in this time, he says, hours can fly by, and I feel neither hunger nor anxiety about anything. He is. I suppose we call it today like a flow state, right? He's in his happy place, right? This is where he is most at peace and most engaged, and he says at the end of that I make little notes of what has transpired, and I have written this little book called On Princedoms, and in this book he describes what he is aiming to do. He tries to explain to princes how to acquire power, how to acquire domains, and how to keep them, and how to rule them, and that provides us this sort of, as you say, this inside view on what his life was like, and why he claims to have written The Prince.
Do you think that it's clear that he's trying to get back in the good graces of the Medicis with this, or
I think I think it's the most reasonable conclusion to now. That being said, yes, and but he's also there are very likely some elements of it that you could call somewhat trollish, right? So. He is being provocative with what he's writing, and he's doing that knowingly. That's why I say trollish.
Sure.
At the time that he writes The Prince, there is this well-established genre of writing called mirrors for princes. And these will be written by philosophers or other kinds of scholarly scholars, which are written to rulers as didactic tools in order to teach them how to be generally good Christian rulers. This is the key thing, right? The key thing. These mirrors for princes are like, here's how you can square the circle of being a good Christian and a good ruler at the same time, because on the face of it, kind of hard, right? There's a lot of things that you need to do as a ruler that are
kind of tough.
Yeah. Kind of tough as a Christian. You got to sign an execution thing, and there's a lot of difficult things that you have to do. But the focus of these mirrors for princes are all about the virtue of the ruler. How can you cultivate personal virtue, the Christian virtues as well, humility and so forth, right? When you're up on a throne, covered in jewels, be humble, right? That's difficult, and that entire genre of writing is focusing on how to occupy that place. It's difficult. Machiavelli's entry takes a very different approach.
Yeah.
It is not concerned with the Christian virtues. Humility is emphatically not something he is concerned about, for instance, among other things. We can talk more about the content of it, but in terms of what he is trying to do, it's important to bear in mind, he knows he's doing something unique. He knows he's doing something different from this established genre, although it is still, no doubt, shares DNA with that genre.
The word that comes to mind is realpolitik to me. Is that a fair assessment? Is that...
in the sense that he is concerned with, and he says this explicitly, numerous times, he is not going to tell you, and it is not his concern here to say, well, look, in an ideal world, here's what we're going to do. Here's what a good ruler would do. Because he's going to say, he does say, if you are concerned to rule the way that an ideal ruler would rule, if you're going to rule over a kingdom of saints, I don't have anything to tell you. I don't have anything for you. Because if you conduct yourself in that way, all you're doing is conducting yourself to ruin. You will just find yourself...
He's concerned with what is, not what...
Indeed, right. So he's saying, yeah, I'm going to give you advice on how to rule actual people.
Right.
People who occupy the world that we know. How should you conduct yourself in a world like that?
And he uses history as a guide. He talks about good leaders and bad leaders. So tell us a little bit about the good leaders. Who are some of the people he highlights as good and why?
Yes, and these are characters. Some of them are going to be characters that we don't because we are these days not as up on the history of the classical period and today, he elevates people like Cesare Borgia, who is an important figure. He's this illegitimate son of a pope. He's an important kind of figure in of one of these great Italian families, Borgias, and he has great success in sort of elevating himself from. Although he has this wonderful background, that is to say, this privileged background, he starts with nothing in the sense that he doesn't have an army or a principality or anything, and then he through virtú, which we can talk about,
yes.
but through the exercise of the kind of virtues that Machiavelli is interested to elevate, he's able to get himself a place and expand his power. Now, ultimately, he meets with misfortune, but he is one of these great figures. Another figure that Machiavelli will emphasize or will discuss is another relatively obscure figure to us today, Agathocles of Syracuse, who is an ancient tyrant, a tyrant meaning just the king of Syracuse, and the way that he elevates himself is by initially also from nothing. He enters the Syracusan army. It rises up the ranks due to being brilliant. One day, he kind of makes a crooked deal, I suppose you might say, with a foreign power, and then he calls together the citizens and the Senate, that is the leaders of the city of Syracuse. He kills them all. He has his soldiers kill them all. He's elevated to the generalship, and then he kills them all, and then he elevates himself to the kingship. And he has a lot of interesting things to say about Agathocles. He is not a fan of Agathocles, which makes Agathocles an interesting character.
Yeah, why?
Because he seems to be engaging in the kind of realpolitik ruthlessness that we associate with Machiavelli, but Machiavelli says we should not call it virtú to slaughter your countrymen. You can say that many things about Agathocles, but you cannot praise him as a good ruler. He does not think that this figure is someone that you should emulate, but he does raise him up as somebody who we should pay attention to, and it's important for understanding what he's doing with this book. This is not an instruction book for tyrants. This is a way to be a successful ruler in the service ultimately of the good of the state. But you're in no position to better the state of the people if you have no power. Right. So how do you have power? How do you keep power in order to do good for the people?
What does he think about Julius Caesar?
He thinks Caesar might very well have proved himself to be a terrible ruler.
And that's interesting because
indeed, because one of the key things that we know about Caesar so Caesar dies before he's able to really be in secure control of Rome for an extended period. Right? He's a very successful military leader. He's a successful politician in Republican Rome. And one of the things that makes him successful is that he is extremely generous, which is to say he gives out tons of money, which he's able to do because he is very rich and because he conquers a fairly large and well-off area, Gaul. Right?
And even in his death, he gave money to the people.
Precisely. And so Machiavelli has this whole chapter about generosity and tight-fistedness, and he says, he says a ruler should not be generous, because if you're generous, eventually you're going to give away all the money in the coffers of the state. And the only way to fill those coffers is by taking money through taxes from the people. People don't like that. So in order to be a good ruler should be tight-fisted with money, because that will allow him to not rob his people. And so Caesar, if he had continued in power and had been as generous in power as he had been,
would he have bankrupted the state?
He would have bankrupted the state, and that would have made him a hated figure, hypothetically.
Yeah. No, and thrice he refused the crown, so we'll never know. But that is a really interesting sort of hypothetical that what could have happened.
And exactly the kind of thing that Machiavelli does with historic figures is that he will elevate people you might not have heard, and then he has not as many good things to say about people that you might think that would be held up to praise.
And one of the things that we should answer now is, before we keep going, is this concept of virtú. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because the word doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. And you said in class once that different translations don't necessarily offer the right word to appropriate context. So can you take that apart for us?
Absolutely. So I'm saying it virtú in this kind of weird way. It sounds kind of weird because I'm trying to maintain that it looks like, and in many editions will be translated as virtue, right? The problem is our connotations with the word virtue are very different from what he would mean. Today, especially in the 21st century, we've got like these 19th century ideas of virtue as being kind of a puritanical thing, right? So being self-denying, being maybe brave or something. But for him, it really comes back to that root word vir, which is Italian, pardon me, not Italian, but Latin for man. Virtù are the manly virtues in the classical tradition, not the Christian tradition. Mm. So again, Christian virtues are like humility and generosity and all that kind of stuff. That is not what he means.
It's more Roman Greco.
He is thinking the Greco-Roman, the vir, the manly, assertive, triumphant,
almost Nietzschean,
conquering. Yes.
I don't want to go down there.
No, yes. But no, yes. Man, the virtù that he means are the qualities that enable you to be successful. The qualities that enable you to be, to get your way. And that might mean being domineering and willful, but it might also mean being cunning and indirect and clever. These are all elements for him of virtù, and that is distinct from the way that most other people will mean it.
So rather than having a bunch of different words for different contexts, it's the one word that you should just sort of understand would apply to whichever characteristic was necessary for that moment.
To some extent, it does. I mean, so it's variously translated. The edition that I assign to my students notes every place in the text that the term occurs, because you have the square brackets and you maintain the Italian virtù, and then it's translated variously as manliness and skillfulness, strength. It'll be translated as also as cunning, but in a whole bunch of different ways. It'll be translated by translators who are trying to capture what exactly he's getting across. So really what you want to do is look at all of those different translations and sort of put them together, and what you get is what I've just described, right? Yeah. The qualities that enable you to be successful.
And in terms of that, all those are characteristics, obviously, even in a modern context, even today, those are all characteristics of leaders in the United States or anywhere that's successful across the world.
Indeed.
And there may be leaders that we could say exemplify virtue. Can you just sort of, in a general sense, can you think of a modern leader who exemplifies some of these characteristics?
I mean, most successful. So one of the things about contemporary democratic politics, the politics of democracies, electoral democracies, right, these tend to elevate ultimately politicians who definitely have a substantial share of what Machiavelli is interested in terms of virtù, because of the competition that is necessary to sort of rise to the top of these systems. So someone like Barack Obama has elements of virtù, absolutely, right? Yeah. There are things that he will that he does in office that will be very cunning, and there will be things that he does in office that might be sort of cutthroat. Letting go of certain policies and allowing certain kinds of forces. So one of the things that Obama got a good deal of I suppose maybe retrospective tarnishing of his legacy is the degree to which he did not put any bankers on on trial for crimes after the financial crisis. Pretty much, there were like one or two people, but there was no cleaning house down in Wall Street. Why? In part because he was concerned about pushback, right? Wall Street, still very powerful on Capitol Hill, could still make a lot of headaches for him politically. And so, if we just kind of like take that history and just kind of put it behind us, then, maybe we can make a more successful pursuit of other policies that might be more important to me to him at that time. But another figure would be someone like Richard Nixon, right? Nixon is a famously sort of underhanded Machiavellian in the sort of dictionary definition way, where he. In the run-up to the this would be sort of
68 election.
Yeah, I mean, and the 1972 election, right, is all sorts of underhanded things that he does in an attempt to, keep himself in power. And these are the kinds of things that I don't know that Machiavelli would recommend doing them, but there are absolutely elements of cunning and the ability to change our stripes. He says at one point, a ruler needs to be prepared to be a fox and a lion. That is to say, sometimes a lion, you need to be strong and overawe your opponents, and sometimes you need to be cunning and indirect, like a fox. And the trick is knowing when to be which.
Or even appearing to be non-threatening if you are.
Exactly.
Too. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
I had one of my mentors was a state legislator who said, sometimes you got to sacrifice 2% of the things you want to get 98% of the good stuff done. You think that sort of applies in this scenario, that sort of look at the greater good?
Yes, absolutely, right. So Machiavelli might say something like, you have to be willing to, if you use like a military metaphor, you need to be willing to sacrifice 2% of your troops to save the other 98%. Or the other way of putting that is that, that 2% might be some interest group, a group of citizens who have some kind of fundamental interest, even a right that's at stake. And so a politician will often be in a position where they have to say, I will allow the violation of this group's rights in order to get these other things done. This was why civil rights for Black Americans were off the political agenda for a century, because both parties had racial conservatives in them,
and it wasn't good politics.
And it wasn't good politics because it would split their party. The Democrats had the Southern conservative wing, who did not want anything to be done on civil rights, and there were hardcore conservatives in the Republican Party who also didn't want anything to be done on civil rights. So you keep civil rights off the agenda, and then we'll go and talk about other things. And if you care about those other things, great. Right? If you happen to be somebody who cares about civil rights, if you happen to be a Black American whose humanity is denied, not so good for you.
And that leads me to asking, he once said the phrase, was it cruelty well used, I suppose. So what is that? Is that like an ends justify the means kind of thing?
So that's one of the most sort of common readings of Machiavelli that he says that people will ascribe to him the view that the ends justify the means. But in fact, the concept of cruelty well used suggests that that's not right at all, right? So this passage, the specific passage is, if I'm not mistaken, is actually about Agathocles, right? Who uses, he says, sometimes you have to use cruelty, but that cruelty can sometimes be used well, such as when it allows you to not do a bunch of cruelty later. When a new ruler takes over a city-state, you might think that what you should be is compassionate and forgive all of your enemies. But if you do that, he thinks, your enemies will learn that you are soft. And so they will conspire against you. And then you will have to be cruel to them later. And you will end up having to be more cruel over a longer period of time than if you had just killed them all at the beginning. And that would allow you to then be compassionate for a longer period of time.
You make an example out front so they know.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. And so when you use cruelty well, you do it for the benefit of the city-state. You do it to maintain your own power, but then also, right, you are, because one of the things that happens when you are cruel well is that you can, according to him, right, he thinks that, for instance, if you publicly put to death an enemy, right. Somebody who's been encouraging disorder in the city, that you can bring about order in the city. Basically, if the people of the city think that you're soft-hearted and you'll forgive them, then you will encourage crime.
So
essentially,
respect is driven from that too, perhaps, is what he would think.
Respect or fear.
Yeah.
So if the people fear you, then the city will be orderly.
And he thinks that it's better to be loved than feared? What does he think?
So there's this classic statement from Cicero. Cicero says, of course it's best to be loved and feared, but if one must choose between love and fear, Cicero says it is better to be loved than feared. Mm-hmm. And Machiavelli inverts that. Mm-hmm. And he says, no. See, the thing is, I can't control whether you love me. Right, love is it's a very difficult thing to cultivate.
Yeah.
Right,
you have to want it.
Sure, yeah, and can't make somebody love you.
That's right.
But you can make somebody fear you. And so he says, I think that it is better to be feared than loved because that's something that I can control, and that means I can control you.
Oh, that's interesting. So out of fear of retribution, you will cooperate.
Precisely. I can get you to behave the way I want you to if you fear me, but if I'm dependent on your love might go away, and then I can't control you.
And the thing that I always worry about when I think of that is, in my own thoughts, is when you have your back turned as a leader who's created this fear, what happens when you're not looking? Who's to say that something bad couldn't happen to you?
Well, yeah, exactly. Someone, again, if you think of a ruler who's known as being kind-hearted and is beloved and is compassionate, turns his back, you take advantage of that. In the same way that like a child, takes, candy from the candy jar when their parents, back is turned because they know their parent will be forgiving of them. Yeah. It's the same kind of thing.
One of the other characteristics he describes is fate or fortuna. So tell us a little bit about that, because virtù and fortuna come together.
Indeed, yes. In Machiavelli's time, Machiavelli again is a very interesting figure. Because of the time that he's writing in 1500, right, basically where we are moving into a period of time that will eventually have he's at the tail end of the Renaissance, and the thing about the Renaissance is you have people turning back to the ancient world. Now, the thing about the ancient world is that it's not Christian. Right?
Yeah, no.
It is not a Christian, not a Christian, but it's not a thing at first. But he's living in a very Christian time. In his day, when you are thinking about how does history unfold, why do things happen, the answer that someone's going to give you is God. God wills it. God's steering. Right? This is the idea of a providential God. Right? God is in the driver's seat. So what we do is we are along for the ride. But that's not the view Machiavelli is going to take. So Fortuna is the classic sort of goddess of fate. Right? Fortuna, is randomness. What causes history? Random things happening. Stuff happens, right?
You get a good wind or you don't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. There's rain or not, right? Yeah, exactly. There's a wind or not. And for Machiavelli, we are not exactly the playthings of fate, but we do not necessarily control fate. We do have some ability to affect fate. Mm-hmm. So in the Prince, he has a chapter that says, fortune is a lady, And like a lady, and this is a bit, of course, sexist and of its time, he says you must sometimes strike and beat her in order to basically get her to...
So you can fight fortune then?
You can fight fortune, and the way that you fight fortune is with the skills of virtú. Virtú is, right, it is, among other things, it is the set of skills that you need. Prudence, foresight, planning. These are all also parts of virtú. And virtú allows you to master fortune.
I see. So you're taming it to your will.
Yes. But fortune is, he also compares fortune to a river. And the thing about a river is that you can try to shape a river by putting in the work to put in some dikes and earthworks and stuff. But fortune can overcome insufficient preparation.
Will crush you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So he says, fortune determines roughly half of our fate. The rest is up to us. And so that gives human beings quite a lot of agency in shaping history and in determining the direction of history. But that's very far from being the masters of our own fate. And it's not at all the same thing as God being in the driver's seat.
So if a person exemplifies virtue and is able to master fortune, that is someone who is, in his mind, a very successful leader.
Yes, absolutely. And this is why, probably the most central figure in terms of the person who comes in for the most praise is Cesare Borgia, who is ruined by bad luck. And so his point is that no one entirely can master fate. Everyone can hit a bad streak of luck that ultimately leads to their downfall.
Could say, you could do everything right, but in the end, it could just be a bad time for you.
That's exactly right. And coming from somebody who has been deposed from a high place in office and has been tortured, and if I remember correctly, he is tortured because it's thought that he is scheming, and I think he was not. So the point being is that
he would know
exactly. He would know what it looks like to hit a bad run of luck.
It'd be like getting elected to the Weimar Republic right before the Nazis take over. I mean, just a bad time.
Not a good place or time to be in. Exactly.
So, what is Machiavelli's general thoughts on religion and human nature? What is he? Is it clear where he's at on that? Just completely separated from politics, or
so slightly different things. We can say on religion, what I was just saying about how as somebody who's coming out of the Italian Renaissance and somebody who's very interested in ancient history and the ancient world, he brings an approach to religion which at his time is very much a no-no, which we call today the civic religion approach. The question he asks about Christianity or religion is not whether it's true. That's the conventional question that you'll get in the philosophy of his time and the theology of his time. Instead, he asks, is it useful? Useful for what? Useful for maintaining the strength of the state. That's the question that he wants an answer to. That's the question that he asks. And he thinks that the ancient cults, that is to say paganism, which is, paganism is a Christian term that's applied to this crazy quilt of the polytheistic world of the ancient ancient world. He thinks that religion was a religion that aided the strength of the state, because you, among other things, you worshipped a god or goddess who was the god or goddess of your city. So Athena being the patron god of the city of Athens, right? So you're an Athenian, you would appraise Athena, and that would aid the strength of your state, because all of we Athenians are
loyalty to the city and the state.
Loyalty to the city, loyalty to the state, loyalty to the religion, but the particular religion of your state. Christianity is a universal religion. It's common to everybody, so we're all God's children, which means,
and as Martin Luther would say, the which is more important, like a God's law or a temporal law, right? So,
right. But the other thing is the ancient virtues, the virtú of the man, right, who's being assertive and so forth, are not the Christian virtues. Christian virtues are humility. And the thing is, humble people make terrible soldiers, right? And so if what you need to maintain your state's independence, to maintain your state's safety and order, are good soldiers. Christians make bad soldiers. Or I should say, maybe Christians don't make bad soldiers, but Christianity makes bad soldiers.
Yeah.
Because it makes people who are not possessed of the ancient virtues, they've got these Christian virtues of being weak and loving and compassionate.
Rome would be a good example, and
Absolutely.
he cites that in his work, right? Rome is a perfect, he loves the Roman example, right?
That's exactly right. The Roman Republic prospers for 1,000 years and conquers the entire known world at the time, the Mediterranean world, because of the virtues of the people and their ability to keep coming back for more.
What about on human nature? Does he just assume that power is the ultimate? Is that what ultimately people who get involved in this process want? Or what does he think?
So, human nature is part of the geography of the world that you must understand if you want to be successful in the world. So you were asking before about the sort of realpolitik.
Mm-hmm.
His view of human nature is of a piece with that, because he thinks human beings are faithless, and they are two-faced, and they are weak. And so you need to take all of those things into account as a ruler. You cannot count on other people to tell you the truth. You cannot count on other people to keep their word. You cannot count on other people to hold to an alliance.
It's very cynical.
You might see it as cynical. He would say but this is how it is.
Yeah.
And this view of human nature helps you. That is to say, if you take up this view of human nature, you are more likely to be successful, because it will encourage you to take precautions, right, against somebody breaking their word. Maybe somebody keeps their word to you. That's great, right? You can take that into your calculus, right? But you also need to be prepared for what if they don't? And that's the key. That's the key insight, right? Is that
contingency, obviously, then.
Precisely. You need to take, because the man of virtue is a man of prudence, is a man of foresight, forethought, right? Planning for what might happen. Because fortune, it will make fools of us all unless we prepare. Build those dikes, build those protections against the flood. So when the flood comes, hopefully you'll be able to survive it, as long as it's not too severe.
And you could see how someone who exemplified these virtues would make a heck of a leader too. I mean, whether or not taking the morality out of it as he did, if you look at that alone, that prudence, that foresight, those attempts at contingencies, I mean, those are all things that I think generally people want in good leaders.
Yes, but I would quibble with you said, the taking the morality out, because he does think, and there are numerous textual examples in The Prince and also in his other work, that he definitely does think that the ruler should take the power that he has and use it for benefiting the people. That's the legitimate purpose of keeping yourself in power, is so that you can be in power and use your power to keep not keep the people, but to benefit the people, to benefit the city.
What happens if the leader violates that?
Then he shouldn't be praised.
I got it.
He shouldn't be praised. Like Agathocles, right? Agathocles uses the power for his own good. He doesn't benefit the people, and that is what makes him not somebody worth praising.
And something else I want to get to before we run out of time is there's this thought process that he might not actually be telling you the truth in parts of this. That some believe that it's possible that Machiavelli's lying to the reader when it comes to conquering republics specifically, which is very interesting because he was a leader in a republic. So,
indeed,
so tell us about that, and do you think there's substance there? Do you think there's truth in it?
Yeah. So this is. So the passage you're referring to is in The Prince. He talks about a bunch of different kinds of principalities one might rule. Is it good to be a bishop who rules over a land, which is a common thing, to be the secular ruler, even though you're a religious ruler? He thinks that's the best one. But one of the circumstances is, what if you are a prince who has come into possession of a formerly free state, which is to say, right, it used to be a republic. And he says, well, the thing that you can do here is you can go and live there, sure. You can try to, the main thing he says is, basically, they're always going to remember their liberty. The flame of liberty will live on in the hearts of the people. The only thing to do is to destroy the city and scatter its people.
Oh, no.
That's all you can do.
Like Carthage.
Right. And the thing is that if you're a prince, like, you want to rule over a city. Like, you don't want to rule over a desert, right? That's not a good thing to do. And so some people have seen his advice on this point as being disingenuous, right? Because effectively, if you're a prince and you're reading that, you'd be like, boy, I should leave free states alone.
It's going to be not worth my trouble.
It's not going to be worth my trouble. Another kind of, the other piece of, the other advice he gives, go and live there yourself. Right. The thing about these old cities, and if you've ever been to like an old like European city, like the old downtown, the historic core, you have these very narrow streets, and these very narrow streets became in the 19th century, in particular in cities like Paris, the geography of revolution, because it turns out it's very hard for soldiers to control cities which have this crazy quilt of very narrow streets. Why is this relevant? If you are a prince and you go to live in a formerly free city-state, and the people decide to rise up, they can get you and kill you pretty easily. So there's a way of reading multiple pieces of advice regarding what a prince should do if he comes into possession of a free state as being self-sabotaging advice, basically, right? Or advice that's going to redound ultimately to the benefit of free states, either by dissuading princes from trying to rule over them in the first place, or putting themselves in danger, right? In the other case. And this speaks to what's known as the two Machiavellis problem. Machiavelli in The Prince can be read, if you ignore some of these passages that I've been pointing out, it can be read as like, oh, it's this amoral pursuit of power kind of thing. But when you read his other major work, which is called the Discourses on Livy, Livy being a Roman historian, it's all about how free states can maintain their freedom. Very much. So it's about power, but it's about the power of free states, the independence of free states. And the two Machiavelli's problem comes from, well, when I read The Prince, he seems like he's telling princes how to rule, and in the discourses he seems to be saying republics, free governments, are the best kind of government. And he says this numerous times. So the two Machiavelli's problem is, how do you put these two things together? And one of the ways of doing that is by saying, well, in The Prince, it's a job application, right? He's like making a case, like a lawyer would make a case. The lawyer might not believe everything that they are saying in making that case, but that's what they need to say in order to try to make their case, right? And so you might interpret some of these passages in The Prince as not entirely square advice, because he is still manifesting his commitment to free governments. And
the average reader might not pick up on that, just because I think that readers tend to see it as a manual whether or not it's intended to or not.
Precisely. And these elements are fairly few and far between, right? In The Prince, it's not that much more to his commitment to free government.
Right. Do you think, I think about Machiavelli across time, or his values, and applying them in a modern context. First, do you think people change? These are the same sort of games played 16th century all the way to the 21st century, right? People don't change all that much, do they?
Right, and that is exactly part of Machiavelli's, he explicitly says this in the Discourses on Livy. He says, yeah, the thing is that people are always the same. And that is actually something that is a little bit controversial for him to say at the time, because during the Renaissance, again, as he says, the view of many Renaissance Europeans, I should say the consensus view, was that the ancients achieved levels of mastery and wisdom that we cannot approach. They are so far beyond us. We are a fundamentally more fallen society than theirs, not just in a Christian sense, but just in the sense of like, they achieved a kind of their achievements are unsurpassable. And Machiavelli's like, no, like, I mean, maybe, but we can try. We should at least try to approach their levels of civic commitment and virtue. Again, virtue in this like classic sense. We should try to achieve the greatness of Rome. That is something that we can aspire to. It's not simply something for the ancient world.
Don't throw in the towel just because you can't get 100% of what you want. It's still worth the fight.
Sure, and also human beings achieved those things in the past. We are human beings too. We can achieve the same level of greatness.
I got it. Well, Machiavelli is a fascinating figure, and of course, you know, I don't think there's anyone when you think of politics, when you think of maneuvering and all the things that go into that, I don't think there's anyone that comes to mind first but him. And we're out of time, but I want to thank you for coming on the show, and we'd love to have you back if you'd be willing to do that again. And it's always a pleasure having you here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for being here. That was my guest, Dr. Kevin Elliott, Murray State University, talking about Machiavelli and the Prince. We'll hope you join us next time.